We've seen a lot of very angry people who are quite happy to clash with the police. We're looking at up to 100,000 people on the streets who've been flown in and been bussed in from all over the country to use this convention as a chance to make a political point.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battle Lines.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
If I had not moved my head at that very last instant, the assassin's bullet would have perfectly hit its mark.
On today's episode, Akhtar Makoii looks at life in Afghanistan 3 years after the Taliban came to power, and how some of its fighters are struggling to adapt to a life without war. And US editor Tony Diver explains why the families of Israeli hostages in Gaza are urging Joe Biden to take a blunter approach to forcing a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. It's Friday, August the 23rd. Since October the 7th last year, every effort to broker an end to the war between Israel and Hamas has foundered on mutual hatred and mistrust. A few days ago, American officials thought they had found a way to a deal. A 3-stage bridging proposal would see Hamas release hostages and Israel gradually withdraw its troops in a manner designed to address both sides' mistrust. But now that deal has fallen apart, and the American families of some of the Israeli hostages are demanding the White House change course. Tony Diver has been speaking to them. I'm joined now by Tony Diver, our US editor, from Chicago, I believe, where you're at the Democratic National Convention. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. We've been here since Monday, where the Democrats are gathered to officially nominate Kamala Harris as the party's nominee for this year's election, and where there's also been plenty of chat about Gaza and what's going on over there.
And that's actually a great opportunity to get into this subject, actually, because you've been speaking to a number of families of hostages whose relatives are either in Gaza and still alive, or whose bodies are being held by Hamas in Gaza, about the state of the peace talks and the American approach to them. Could you just, we're hopefully going to play some of that to our listeners so they can hear for themselves, but can you just walk us through what they said and what their advice was for the administration?
Yeah, I can. I spoke to 3 hostage family members, actually, who all had slightly different experiences. One of them, Ruby Chen, his son, Akhtar, was a member of the IDF. He's an Israeli-American who was fighting with the IDF and was killed on October 7th, but they didn't know that he had died immediately. They thought he'd been taken hostage. In fact, his body had been taken hostage where it remains in Gaza, and he's pushing the administration to help bring his son's body home. And then I also spoke to Gilly Raymond and Maya Raymond, who are relatives of 2 other hostages, one who was released in November by Hamas and has since returned, and another who is still in Gaza at the moment. So I feel like I got a fairly sort of comprehensive view of the various different situations that these families have been left in. Because I think when we talk about this in terms of a number of people who are there, and we think about this in terms of statistics, it's hard to weave together the individual stories of these families.
I'm Maya Roland. On October 7th, I was at my parents' house. We woke up to the missile alarms. We all went to the shelters. And I started getting a lot of messages from my kind of colleagues saying, well, something's not right, something is different this time around. I can only compare it to what it was like to be American during 9/11, to like have this slow realization of like, wow, it was a holiday, Simchat Torah. And Kibbutz Be'eri is one of the kibbutzim that are closest to the border. And so during the day, we lost touch with her around 10:30 a.m. We got a call from Alon, Yerdon's husband, and he told us what happened. Around 10:30, armed gunmen entered his parents' home. And his parents were both in the kitchen getting some food for the rest of the family who were all in the shelter. Alon's father, Eshel, was able to hide in the bathroom. The terrorists shot at him through the bathroom door, but they miraculously missed him. And they took Kineret, his wife. We saw a video of her being walked with a few other hostages around the kibbutz. So at first we thought she was fine, but later that day we saw the other half of that video, which shows her having been shot in the head, not far from her home.
Cool.
Yeah, we saw it on social media.
despite their different experiences, all three that I spoke to had a pretty united view on what the US administration should do. I spoke to them 2 days ago, that's Monday, where at that point we still had no white smoke on the peace talks. We'd had Joe Biden and Tony Blinken telling us that they thought this was a breakthrough moment and there was a possibility of some agreement between Israel and Hamas. That never materialized. And what all three of them told me was that they thought that if this latest round of talks and the so-called bridging deal that the US has proposed doesn't go through, then the US should be looking at Plan B, a different kind of negotiating strategy with Hamas, and a movement from the policy that it's been pursuing for the last few months, which is to look at a stage-by-stage deal whereby some hostages and some element of Israeli withdrawal happens at different time points. Their feeling was perhaps that if Hamas won't agree to that, and if they will continue to push Israel for a greater withdrawal earlier on, then perhaps the US should be looking at some kind of all or nothing deal where everything is agreed in one go. Although I think everyone acknowledges that that will be even harder to negotiate than the current strategy.
So first and foremost, we're here to thank the Biden-Harris administration, because it is really crucial to say that they have been amazing. I don't think Yarden would be here if it wasn't for them. And that's something they need to hear, and they need to understand what that means. That's why we're still doing this, is because we are able to tell people this is what we're fighting for, both the Israeli government and Hamas. And we know that Republicans are the ones that are best suited to pressure our current government. Whereas we believe Democrats need to be more mindful of their messaging and understand they also need to put some pressure on Hamas. When the head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, sees the conversation revolving only around Netanyahu, it does not make him feel the need to sign a deal. And one of the things we noticed in our past months here, and one of the things we keep hearing from Democratic senators, is that their constituents don't know who Sinwar is. We're not able to get his name out there. So that's one of the things that's really important for us, is for people to start realizing who we're dealing with. This is someone known as the butcher. This is someone who has strangled Palestinians with his own hands. And when people here don't know that, it creates a void in the conversation that allows them to say ignorant things like, why don't the Palestinians protest? They're against Hamas. They don't protest because they will be murdered. So you have to have that in the conversation. And the Democratic Party is the one more able to bring this into the conversation, but also the ones that would pay a heftier price if they start going that road.
It's very easy to understand why after, getting on for a year, these families are asking for suggesting that there should be a plan B. In fact, one of the guys you spoke to in your article said, every time I meet a US administration official, I'm saying, what is the plan B? I hope they've got a plan B, because it's been so incredibly frustrating. Why is this just constantly slipping out of view or just slipping through the diplomats' fingers, Tony? Because a couple of weeks ago, not that long ago, we were basically told by the United States, essentially, that this deal was imminent, that finally, Israel and Hamas had come together around what you described as this bridging provision. And then suddenly it's vanished, and suddenly we're told that we're no nearer than we were before. What exactly is going on?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it is quite difficult to work out exactly what's going on, because to a large extent we're relying on briefings from both sides. Of course, the Israelis blame Hamas and Hamas blames the Israelis for the hold-up. Both sides say that they want to reach a deal as soon as possible. I think there's a few things that we can kind of decipher, though, from what has been reported. The first is that there has been some movement from the Israelis on the Fidelity corridor as one of two major corridors into Gaza, which is currently occupied by the IDF and which the Israelis are policing. One of Hamas's key demands is that the IDF moves out of those areas. And it looks as if Netanyahu has moved on that, and he said that he's willing to withdraw some of his troops. So that's one of the areas where there may have been some kind of compromise. The other is around this issue of whether or not the ceasefire is immediate and permanent. Now, Hamas said earlier this year that they were willing to negotiate a temporary ceasefire and the release of some hostages, and that ceasefire would then be conditional on whether or not the remaining phases of the negotiation continue in good faith. There has gone backwards and forwards on that. Sometimes Hamas says that they would only negotiate if on day one there is a full withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza and an immediate and permanent ceasefire. Sometimes they say they'd be willing to put up with a temporary ceasefire. Now, on the Israeli side, of course, withdrawing all troops and ending the military operation in Gaza on day one without the release of all hostages is an unacceptable proposal from Hamas because, in the words of the hostage families that I spoke to, well, where's the guarantee that any remaining hostages would be released if the IDF has no leverage from that point onwards? So it seems that is the area of tension at the moment, the extent and the timeline for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. I mean, there are other elements of this negotiation going on. Israel has demanded that there are long-term security guarantees. The negotiations over the so-called day after the war finishes. To what extent does Israel have control over the security situation in Gaza? To what extent do Palestinians have the ability to choose their own security apparatus and their own politicians? That's all on the table as well. But that stuff is probably for later phases of negotiation once we get over this first stage. But at the moment, it does seem as if a deal has just slipped through the fingers of both sides and of the US, which is trying to break it with this bridging proposal.
And where does this leave the US actually? Because of course, they have been leading the efforts to get this done. We saw Antony Blinken on Tuesday this week, so I think just yesterday actually, we're talking listeners on Wednesday evening, leaving the Middle East after his 9th trip since the war began on October 7th, saying that, this deal has to be done and it has to be done in the next few days. It's absolutely imperative that hostages are let go and there's a ceasefire. And yet he seems impotent. How damaging is this and how frustrating is this for the State Department and for Washington?
Well, I think it is frustrating. I mean, it's worth saying that this is not the first time we've had words like that from Tony Blinken. He says similar things most times that he goes to the Middle East. And as you say, this was his 9th visit. I think this is the point where US negotiators felt that they had the closest chance of getting a deal, and clearly it hasn't worked. But there is a time factor here. It's assumed that many of the hostages who are still being held by Hamas in Gaza are now dead, and it's expected that death toll will rise the longer these negotiations go on. There is huge political pressure on the Americans to try and sort this out as quickly as possible. And there is also, from a political point of view, the looming presidential election, which is happening in November. And I think that has a couple of important impacts on the discussions. The first of which is that there's no guarantee that the Biden-Harris administration or the Democrats will be in power come the inauguration in January. So there is a feeling that they want to get it done before then. And there is also a political incentive to get this sorted before the election, because there is a substantial minority of Democrats who have been very critical of the way the Biden administration has handled this war and feel that they should be pushing for a ceasefire and achieving a ceasefire as a number one political priority. So when we heard from Joe Biden at the DNC on Monday night, he banged the lectern as he spoke, and he said, we must end this war now, regardless of the dispute that's happened between various Democrats over Israel and Palestine over the last few months. If a ceasefire was to be achieved with the help of US negotiations, it would be a huge boost to the Harris campaign as they head towards November's election. So I feel like there is some political incentive from Washington to try and get it sorted as soon as possible. But they will only be able to broker a deal if, not to state the obvious, they will only be able to broker a deal if they can get both sides to agree. This is not within the US's gift at this point.
Tony, you are at the Democrat National Convention in Chicago. A big thing. I think we're speaking Wednesday night. I think Kamala Harris is speaking. Is it tomorrow evening?
That's right.
But there have been protests about this issue. How is it playing out there? What are the discussions around Gaza, around Israel like, amongst the people you're talking to there?
Well, I don't think there is a huge number of elected Democrats who are in opposition to the administration's position on Israel at the moment. There are some, but there are not very many, and we haven't heard from them, as you might expect, other than the main convention stage, because the Democrats are very keen to avoid this turning into a huge row about Gaza for the whole 4 days that they're here. What we have seen is on the fringes, in some of those fringe events which are happening outside of the main convention hall and on the streets of Chicago, a very vocal group of people who are concerned about the administration's support for Israel. And, we're looking at up to 100,000 people on the streets who've been flown in and been bussed in from all over the country to use this convention as a chance to make a political point. Now, to put that in some context, at the Republican National Convention, which we had last month, there was no real meaningful protest going on the streets. People weren't hugely protesting Donald Trump, as perhaps they'd been expected to. It seems that the anger and the ire of liberals is at the moment being directed at their own side and not at the Republicans. So there's that going on. Separately to all of that, there's also been some kind of administrative, logistical knock-on to all of this, which is that the protesters have successfully managed to get over a couple of police barriers around the convention centre. huge police presence here in Chicago, but protesters in some cases were able to overwhelm the police. And that meant that some of the entrances to the main convention center were closed, and that funneled everyone else through a different entrance, which meant that there were 2-hour queues to get in to Barack Obama's speech yesterday. So, the protesters at the very least have managed to anger some of the delegates and disrupt some of the convention, which is, I think, partly what they were hoping to. And in the meantime, the party has to contend with the fact that their positive headlines about what's going on in the speeches have been placed next to pictures of people burning flags on the streets of Chicago and carrying their placards and demonstrating against what the administration is doing on Israel.
I mean, the blunt question is this issue divisive enough, do you think, to split the Democrat vote? As you said, it's a Democrat problem. It's not a Republican one.
Well, I don't know that it's enough to split it in any meaningful way. I think what it will do is erode some Democrat support in some key swing states. So if you look at Michigan is the main one, where you have a large population of American Muslims who, generally speaking, are quite critical of the Biden administration's support for Israel. You find that those voters are unlikely to go over to Donald Trump. They're unlikely to ever support the Republicans, but they might stay at home on the 5th of November. And in states where it's looking incredibly tight, in Dearborn, Michigan, or Detroit, where there are large groups of Muslims and where the vote is incredibly close, that could have a major impact on the overall result. And, it will depend on how the Harris campaign was to try and get its 270 electoral delegates. But if they're going down the old Biden strategy, the so-called blue wall, the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, I think the campaign will find that if they're not able to satisfactorily answer some of these questions about the war in Gaza, then they will see their vote share hit. And the Trump campaign obviously will be doing as much as it can to try and exploit those divisions between now and then.
I mean, that is a powerful reminder of how the echoes of this war, which is, of course, fundamentally the worst and most horrible in Gaza itself, but it's having impacts all across the world. As you said, it might affect the outcome of the US election in November. But to just add another little bit of context for listeners, in case one has forgotten, because world events move so fast these days. A couple of weeks ago, we seemed to be on the brink of an all-out war between Iran and Israel in the Middle East, which was pulled back from the brink when basically Iran linked its threat to retaliate against Israel for an assassination. It basically said, after a lot of backdoor diplomacy, okay, if there's a ceasefire deal in Gaza, maybe we'll step back from that, which put more impetus into this diplomatic track. There's a lot riding on this globally, right?
That's right. And certainly American diplomats have said that about the latest negotiations. I think you're completely right that that's where a lot of the hope came from in this latest round, because there was a feeling that if these talks completely collapse now, perhaps if the US just withdrew and started on a plan B strategy or whatever, that would open up a vacuum politically for Iran then to strike Israel in that anticipated strike. I mean, again, not to state the obvious, this conflict, which began as a terror attack on Israel by Hamas, has turned into something of a proxy war now, with Iran on one side and the US on the other. And the US has been extremely explicit about how much of a threat it sees Iran as. There have been recent cyber attacks on both sides, on Donald Trump's campaign and on the Biden administration, from Iranian-linked groups. And administration officials have been extremely clear that they see Iran as a major threat. So I think we are seeing, like you say, this war play out on the international stage as something of a superpower conflict. And of course, what's actually going on the ground, the humanitarian situation is of paramount importance as well.
Tony, thank you so much for guiding us through the diplomacy, the high politics, the Middle East. I wanted to turn, before we leave, to what you touched on just now, the streets of Chicago, because on Battle Lines before, we have talked about, stability in the United States. We've talked about Alex Garland's Civil War movie, about polarization, about what could happen in this election, about, the assassination attempt against Donald Trump, all this stuff going on. Going into this convention, there was a lot of talk about the 1968 Democrat Convention, those historic scenes of just utter chaos on the streets of Chicago, outside the police crackdown on the anti-Vietnam demonstrators and so on. I think, has anything, you've touched on it already, anything comparable to 1968 transpired? And what are you feeling now in your travels around the United States about that central question about polarization, about radicalization within the US?
Well, I think some of the scenes on the streets here have been pretty stark. As I said, we've seen protesters burning American flags. We've seen some, quite unsavory placards. We've seen a lot of very angry people who are quite happy to clash with the police. And a note went out by one protest organizer saying that bruises from the Chicago police were going to be the hot accessory, the hot back to school accessory this fall. So, there's no shortage of anger, I think. I mean, in terms of the actual on the ground situation, it does appear that the policing operation has been pretty successful, apart from a couple of skirmishes and the protesters getting through a barrier on Monday night. It does seem that this has been largely kept under control. I also don't think, in comparison to 68, there is less high political pressure on Kamala Harris to take a harder stance against Israel. I mean, her party is largely quite united on this issue. And the Republicans, of course, are even more supportive of Israel than the Democrats are at the moment. She has attempted to kind of mollify that wing of her party by not turning up to Benjamin Netanyahu addressing Congress last month. And it appears so far, and we do speak on Wednesday night with a day left to go, that she's managed to keep a lid on all of this. Looking ahead more broadly, I'd say the biggest risk to, the safety of American streets is not this conflict. It's not these protests. It's what happens in November with the election. And Trump and the Republicans have been quite clear that if there is a narrow Harris victory, as is looking most likely at the moment, I would say, they will be very skeptical of that result, and they may attempt to overturn the election result again. There has been no commitment from Trump that he will respect the result of the election in exactly the same way as he didn't respect the result of the election last time, which ultimately led, as we saw, to the January 6th riots on Capitol Hill. So that, in my opinion, is the biggest threat to the security of American streets at the moment. And I think the Democrats are well aware that they will need to win this election by a significant margin if they're going to avoid some of that. And when Michelle Obama spoke to the convention last night, she said the same thing. She said this is going to come down to a precinct to precinct race where the margins are extremely tight, and the Democrats need to leave the country under no illusion about their victory if they're going to do so peacefully. That said, of course, there's a long way to go. This election has been completely turned on its head twice now in the last 2 months. So although it's looking like a Harris marginal victory is the most likely outcome at the moment, there is no guarantee that that's the case.
Tony, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Last week, Taliban fighters publicly marked the third anniversary of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan with military parades and fireworks. They have reason to celebrate. The hardline group's grip on power is firm. It's reimposed its radical Islamist rule unopposed, including restrictions on women, and this week banned the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, Richard Bennett. But in private, many of the former insurgents say they're struggling. Professionally, they were never prepared for the challenges of actually running a country. And personally, they're finding it difficult to cope with the boredom of civilian life. Akhtar Makoii told me about his conversations with them.
You've written this fascinating article. So to set the context, this August is now 3 years since the Western withdrawal and the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. And there's lots that we can dig into about the state of Afghanistan now. But the really interesting thing you've done is you've gone and spoken to several ex-Taliban fighters about how they are adapting to civilian life. And the conclusion seems to be is not that well, that it's quite difficult. Just tell us, who you spoke to and what did they say?
Yeah, as you said, they are ex-Taliban fighters, but currently they are officials. They are sitting behind desk every day from morning until evening. And then the day the Taliban fought NATO and Afghan security forces for 20 years to have Afghanistan. And now that they have it, they are longing for the very same war. And when it comes to the Taliban as authorities, not insurgents, not fighters, we are talking about especially their establishment in Kandahar and also some ministers in the capital, Kabul. We are talking about a group of clerics who, most of them went to religious schools across the border in Pakistan. They studied a very harsh interpretation of the Islamic law, and then they fought Soviet Union, and then there was a civil war that erupted after Soviet forces lifted, and then there was a 20 years long war against Afghan national security forces and NATO, and now suddenly they are ministers. And many of them are now to cope with this new change. And just today, we were working for the Global Health Security Desk. We were talking about lead poisoning in Afghanistan. So I found officials in the Taliban's Ministry of Health. I talked with two of them. They had no clue what I was talking about. And when you come down to the like junior civil servants, that's even worse. That many of them, like almost all of them, were trained to die. And then and just remember, Afghanistan is the only country in the world that has a official suicide squad inside the army. And now these people are civil servants. So many of them are bored with office jobs. They told us that they didn't expect that the office job would be this boring. One of them even said that he craves war.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, I'm just rereading your article now. I've got it in front of me. Myself, what exactly I'm doing. I was raised and trained to be at war, to be a fighter, not behind a desk with my green and black tea always ready. I crave war now. I have my gun, and sometimes I go to the nearby mountain with my son and shoot. Since the jihad has ended, I end days in the office, and when the nights fall, memories of jihad come back. I mean, there's some specifics here, but part of what struck me about that is just how universal it is, because a part of me, when I stopped war reporting for a while, and you have to adapt to kind of living in an office, there is that kind of process of adaptation. The other thing is it really echoed a conversation I was having with a friend who recently left the Ukrainian army after 2 years in combat and then found himself back in his office job, being a lawyer, staring at a desk and so on. This is, to an extent, this is quite a universal thing, isn't it, with countries after war? What's more specific to Afghanistan here?
Yeah, it's all about that adrenaline. And the more specific about Afghanistan is that it's the religion was involved in the war. So they were fighting for something more than Afghanistan. They were fighting to have Afghanistan, but it was jihad, to die for God. And then they had that other adrenaline of going to war, like ambushes and then suicide attacks. But that jihad, that opportunity of dying for God is now taken away from them somehow. And then they are stuck behind desks inside offices doing paperwork every morning. And as you just read that bit of the article, almost all of them, of course, all of them still have the guns, and then they go to wherever they can find to shoot, so they can feel that adrenaline they had during the war.
There was another thing I noticed. That chap said he takes his gun out, he goes up the mountain to let off some rounds, just to kind of feel a bit of adrenaline. There's another guy who says, I've been asking to be sent to Panjshir, where there is still a kind of resistance to the Taliban, because he could do some fighting there. He's begging for that transfer. And one of your interviewees said, if I could go and fight in Palestine, that'd be great. So I was wondering, I mean, extrapolating from that, is there any sense that a lot of, ex-Taliban fighters who fought and don't know what else to do are starting to leave the country looking for jihad or looking for military work elsewhere?
Yeah, they would love that. I mean, they're like almost everyone I spoke with, they said they would love to go to Palestine and fight against Israel. That's something all of the Taliban, almost all of them would love to do. It's very evidence of their public statements, and also whenever they talk in private, in public, it's very evident that they would like to leave the country. But in terms of if anyone has left Afghanistan to fight in another war, that's something we don't know. And it looks like highly unlikely, because they have the country now they were fighting for. And Afghanistan, like the Taliban, were not like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, that they had an international operation to do something outside, like something globally. They were just focused on Afghanistan to have Afghanistan. And now they have it.
We talk a lot in the West. We talk endlessly about this kind of thing, right? We talk, there's a big public discussion about the effects of war on soldiers, the difficulty of transitioning from military to civilian life, about post-traumatic stress disorder, all of this kind of thing. Is there any kind of awareness in Afghanistan of those kinds of issues? I mean, is this kind of discussed in any way, kind of societal level? Or do they just know that they're bored and they're fed up and they're finding it difficult?
Yeah, during the previous regime, the US-backed government, there was some discussions and some government offices that they would deal with these sorts of war trauma and such a stuff. But currently, the Taliban do not have anything regarding, not even them, like the people, like we are talking about 40-something million people, like more than 15 million of them do not even know where their next meal would come from. They do not have anything for them. So let alone, like, that's something more than that a Taliban official or a Taliban fighter would think about, let's focus on if people are traumatized by war. And for themselves, the fighters previously, in terms of if you talk about future, previously they had these sorts of shadow governments in their control in the areas under their control, where they had these secret schools to teach their interpretation of this, to radicalize children, simply. But now that system, that secret system to radicalize children for the future, is now the official education ministry. So if you are thinking about in the future, if anything would change, that's highly unlikely too, because the new generation would be officially radicalized to run the country.
And that brings us neatly to kind of where Afghanistan is 3 years on from the Western withdrawal, 3 years of Taliban government. You note in your article, August 15th, which marks the takeover, was marked by a holiday. Fighters are out in Herat, letting off fireworks, shooting their rifles in the air, big celebration. But, 3 years in, where do you think Afghanistan is? I mean, obviously, it's had a tough time with the famine and food issues in the immediate aftermath of the withdrawal. Western governments are still refusing to recognize it, largely because of the extreme restrictions placed on women's education. Where is Afghanistan now, 3 years after this? And are there any grounds for, I don't know, a kind of optimism given that there's peace, or is it a pretty bleak picture?
I think it is a very bleak picture. The thing is that the Taliban, as I mentioned earlier, 15 million people, the Taliban are ruling a country where 15 million of its population do not know where their next meal would come from. And last week, but they are celebrating their 3rd year anniversary in power anyway. Last week they had a parade in Bagram airfield, which was the United States main Air Force base for 20 years of war. And they were showing American military vehicles left behind by the United States forces. And at the same time, there was also a parade of suicide bombers with yellow water buckets. And then, as you mentioned, women are severely restricted. And even since they took power, there has been several devastating earthquakes. Thousands of people died, flash floods, and then there is this poverty. They are seriously struggling to cope with running the country. I mean, the thing they were previously doing was just fighting the NATO and Afghan national security forces, and that was their problem to deal with the people. But now it's the Taliban's issue to run that country of which poverty rages on. I also tried to talk with the Taliban sport authorities about the Afghanistan Olympics team. And they had no clue what I was talking. They were keep referring me to other officials, and no one didn't give me an answer.
So it sounds like it sounds like a real mess, to be honest. You could, I suppose, say we've all had conversations with bureaucracies in all kinds of countries where no one knows the answer, but it does sound like a mess. And if you've had a conversation with the health ministry where no one has heard of what lead poisoning is, for example, it sounds like a really, really difficult transition, or that actually this movement is struggling to run the country in basic ways.
Yeah, I mean, in many offices, especially in remote places, people have a staff job just because they were good during the jihad. And in many of these offices, they just remove the desk. They don't feel comfortable with desks to sit behind the desk, so they just sit on the floor. And people come and they do the paperwork while they sit on the floor because they don't feel comfortable sitting behind the desk. They never had that experience. They never trained for, and they're more comfortable sitting on the floor.
And did any of the previous bureaucracy survive? I mean, did anyone who knew, did they inherit any former civil servants from the previous regime, or did everyone go, and that means that there's no kind of institutional memory for them to draw upon?
Yeah, there are a few, but many, like people who knew the job have fled the country. But the ones who are with them, like from the previous reign, they would be like junior civil servant official, and now because they are the only people left, they have some sort of jobs in the ministries in Kabul. But at the end of the day, the Taliban are making the decisions. At the end of the day, the Taliban are making the decisions because they don't trust anyone from the previous government. They targeted many. And they don't think that whatever they would decide is according to their religion. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Ministry of Health or Ministry of Sports or Foreign Ministry. The final decision maker is always a cleric who has spent his life at war.
That's interesting, Akhtar. There was a report that was just published, I think, this week that said members of Al-Qaeda are returning to Afghanistan. A large number of Al-Qaeda remnants, I suppose, have moved to Afghanistan with their families. What do we know about that? And how true would it be to say that it is, again, a safe haven for these people?
Yeah, in mid-June, the Al-Qaeda's leader, Saif al-Adl, actually announced it urged its supporters to go to Afghanistan and enjoy the situation, enjoy the Taliban, and get trained there and go and come back to the Western countries and do suicide attacks, like any sort of attacks they could. He urged, Saif al-Adl, Al-Qaeda's leader, urged its supporters to go to Afghanistan and get trained and come back to the West and fight. And he also urged any Muslim who were living in the Western countries to go to Afghanistan, to go to any other Muslim country, particularly Afghanistan, because those people who are getting trained and who will get trained in Afghanistan and would do some sort of attacks in the West, they wouldn't know if anyone is Muslim or not. So they urged Muslims from European countries, American countries, to just go to Afghanistan. And also there is also a blame game between Pakistan and the Taliban. Yesterday, the Taliban was saying that yesterday Pakistan's envoy for Afghanistan said there is a big danger that another 9/11 attack would originate from Afghanistan. And then today, the Taliban's foreign ministry said, no, there are this very similar danger present in Pakistan, that another 9/11 attack would originate from Pakistan, not the Taliban. So there are some movements of Al-Qaeda in the region, but the Taliban would not acknowledge that. And they also have a problem with ISIS K, ISIS Khorasan. They have some movements in the eastern parts of Afghanistan along the border with Pakistan. They have been fighting with them, but they said this week that ISIS is no longer any danger. And there is also a resistance going against them in Panjshir Valley, central Afghanistan. Talibans are ethnically Pashtun, and they have much more support in the southern parts of Afghanistan than central. So most of those people who are resisting against their rule, they are from Tajik background. So, but there is sort of resisting, still moving on there. And how they do it's like they just swapped sides. So now they do this sort of guerrilla attacks, like here and there in Kabul. They would just place a bomb along the way of a Taliban's convoy, and then similar things that what the Taliban would be doing.
So how firm then is the Taliban's grip on the country? And is there any form of, domestic opposition besides those guerrilla movements?
They don't see that there isn't any challenge to their grip and power. This is the first, previously when Taliban were in power in the 90s, they had control over 90-something% of the country. They didn't have control over this valley, which is resistance is going on now, and also another town in the northeast. But now it's the first time the Taliban have all of Afghanistan. And they don't see any serious person, any serious group to challenge them. And some people are supporting them, especially, as I said, in the south and along the border with Pakistan. But many don't. They are suffering under their rules, very restricted rules, and playing cards, card games, and poll was also banned. And then if anyone wants to play these sort of games, because they are called against the religion, they have removed all of these cafes. And then if anyone wants to play such sort of sports games, they should go somewhere out of town, because they are not religiously good to be played inside cities.
Have you been to Kabul recently? What could you tell us about the mood in the capital 3 years on from the transition?
3 years on from the transition, Kabul, before the August 2021, whenever you would go to Kabul, you would see a very big presence of women on the streets when we would be shopping, and then some of them would have their headscarves. But now that sense is gone. You barely see women at all on the streets. Even if you see them, they're covered in that blue burqa. And if women at the time would also be able to travel around the capital, around Kabul for picnics or whatever. But now that is not possible. If they want to leave the city, they should be accompanied by a male guardian.
Is there anything else that's changed in Kabul? I mean, is it poorer? Is it richer? Is there anything about the atmosphere, or is it particularly the absence of women that is what you notice?
No, the absence of women is one thing, and then previously there would be businessmen, like rich people, investing in the capital, building like high-rise like buildings and stuff. But that you don't see any construction going on anymore in the country, because those people who had the money left the country, and the one who left, there are still some keep coming to Afghanistan and leaving. That their main reason is to just come and sell their properties and leave. The other thing which you would notice today in Kabul is like you wouldn't see any construction going on, and streets are previously you would see busy streets, crowded, everyone shopping, but you don't see that sense of enthusiasm in people anymore. If you just walk on the streets, like a feeling of sadness over the city, and people are both traumatized by the Taliban's rules and also disappointed by what the United States did with the country by leaving it in the middle of a war.
Thank you, Akhtar. That's really, really useful.
Thank you.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.